For the past 3 episodes of Severance, I felt pretty sure that we'd been watching Helena on the severed floor. Thinking if that were true, we'd probably never get Helly R back, and trying to figure out ways that might happen. So at the end of episode 4, I had one of those not like that moments. Not after another character we're heavily invested in almost drowns her in the freezing cold water near the largest waterfall on the planet. The good news is that we no longer have to debate which version of Ms. Egan was hanging out in MDR. And the bad news is, well, extensive. Heartbreaking in the case of Irv's immediate and permanent dismissal. Thank goodness for Audi Irv's developing storyline, which means we won't be losing John Turturro anytime soon. But on some level, this sort of has to be a real death for the innie, because if they were to bring him back, we'd be entering a situation where there were no stakes related to the decisions the innies make. Speaking of that, I wonder how innie Mark is going to feel about his steamy night in the tent with Helena when the implications to that start to set in. Of course, this is only part of the problem, since they let the future CEO of Lumen in on everything they'd been planning and doing in their search for Ms. Casey. This is going to take some time to process, which is how this episode had me feeling through a lot of it. While I'm generally very much into a nice weird departure episode, I think I'm probably going to be in the minority of fans who didn't completely love this one. I'll get into that later, and I just want to clarify that I think it was a good episode, just not perfect or my favorite, which didn't match up with a lot of the hype I saw about it online this week from early reviews. The main issue I had was that things were so disorienting that I couldn't be sure if any of it was really happening the first time I watched it. I'm guessing this was by design. It's the innies' first sanctioned trip outside, and they didn't know it was coming. It would be confusing for them, and I think what the writers and director Ben Stiller were trying to do was put us there with them, which sounds like a good idea. Woes Hollow opens with innie Irv waking up, out fucking side, to quote Dylan, standing on the ice above a frozen lake. He shouts hello. Mark responds from on top of a nearby hill, and they're dressed appropriately for the weather that appears to be really cold. All 4 macrodats eventually appear, which is to say wake up in different places, but the way it's put together makes it feel almost as if they materialize out of nowhere. When they come together, no one knows what's happening, but a version of Kier's hymn that sounds like it was made for an old video game draws them to a TV where Mr. Milchek explains things televisually. He's pleased to welcome the Refiners to their first outdoor retreat team building occurrence, or ORTBO. He tells them exactly what's happening. Their Audis have agreed to let them be activated for 2 days outside of the office in the Dieter Egan National Forest so that they can experience the outside world. Dieter Egan is a new name for them and us, and Milchek explains that this is because he's mentioned in the 4th appendix, a text of such sanctity that it's forbidden on the severed floor. So the ORTBO is essentially a quest. They have to make their way to Scissor Cave, where Seth tells us Kier first tamed the 4 tempers, to find this book that he dictated in the final hours of his life. There'll be help along the way, and maybe temptation, because he ends with the warning, "Stray not from Kier's path, lest you roil nature's wrath." It's set up as a continuing lore drop for the innies, and as viewers, we kind of know Irv is right, and we shouldn't believe a word out of that mountebank's mouth. The help along the way is introduced when someone who looks like Mark appears in the distance to point them in a direction, which turns out to be a super interesting detail. In episode 1, when Mark finally makes his way into what used to be wellness after running around the severed floor, there's a brief shot of a mysterious man standing in the hall behind him. This led to quite a bit of speculation because even though the actor was credited at the end of the episode, it wasn't a name we'd seen before. At the end of this one, all of MDR Shadow versions are listed in the credits, and Shadow Mark is played by Adam Jepson, the same actor who played the mysterious man in the hall. None of these actors have much in the way of credits. Helly's has some as a dancer and choreographer, so it doesn't seem likely that they'll play significant parts going forward. And so yeah, I don't know what it means. Still, I found the appearance of Mark Shadow in multiple episodes very curious. My initial thinking on that scene was that this was a new security guy. And when we see them all together later in the episode, I'm not sure what's going on with them, which is something we'll come back to. The show decides to skip the opening credit sequence this week, and after what feels like it might be aimless wandering propped up by some great-looking stark landscape shots, Shadow Helly points them toward Scissor Cave, where Helena discovers the fourth appendix mounted on a wall. This reminded me of video games, although there may be a real-world equivalent I'm not privy to. The text opens with a whopper and tells the story of a Boyhood trip they took to Woe's Hollow. The MDRs are to follow in their footsteps, and of course, Irv is the most lit up about this new bit of lore, which in the end turns out to be an allegory for masturbation, at least for the innies. I'm not sure allegory would be the right word from our perspective, since when you go past the colorful language, it's just obviously a story about a boy getting down with himself in the woods. Which, don't get me wrong, this is all very funny as you start to put it together and figure out what they're doing. As he spilt his lineage upon the soil is a particularly memorable line. The voiceover of reading the text starts with Helena and is picked up by Irv, who, as I mentioned, you would guess to be the most receptive refiner to this type of thing. The problem is that he's still suspicious about Helly, and he brings it up after he sees her sharing a private moment with Mark. He says he doesn't trust her or her story about a night gardener, and that Mark can't be objective and see the obvious because of his feelings for her. After they come across what appears to be a dead seal and Irv floats the idea of eating it, things get heated when Mark says they all know he had a bad experience the last time he went outside, and Irv gets defensive. I have no idea if we're supposed to see this as a random encounter or something Lumen staged as part of the Ortbo. I didn't see any definitive evidence either way. It's weird. I don't know how it would have gotten there, but for the story, it works as a way to foreshadow any Irv's death regardless. The idea of them seeing what death looks like, something that isn't supposed to be possible on the severed floor, might make sense as a warning if this was staged, which, also, from the little I know about seals, it does feel out of place. But I guess the important part is that it serves to highlight just how much the team building part of this outing isn't working. Irv is aggressive, and it feels like he's essentially having a bad reaction. He creates some static between him and Dylan by insinuating that he told Mark and Helly about their private conversations and calling him a dumbass in the process. The group is as divided as we've ever seen, but they push on to Woe's Hollow, where Mr. Milchek awaits them. The Shadow Selves, or twins, are also there, still noticeably off in the distance so that you can't get a good look at them. Seth picks up on Dieter's story, saying that Kier's twin was always with him. That's why they provided the very same for each of them. Then he delivers one of the episode's funniest lines when he tells them they're looking at the tallest waterfall on the planet, which it's definitely not, and selling it the whole way. Their twins look odd and you can't miss that. I heard a theory from a couple of people who saw the episode early that they could be animatronic, something that the replacement refiner Gwendolyn mentioned when talking about the Perpetuity Wing at 5X. With that in mind, they do look stiff, their clothes look weird blowing in the breeze, and as I already said, it's a point that we always see them from far away. I think we get the best look at Dylan's, and the most notable detail is the wig he's wearing. Plus, they don't do much other than raise their arms and point, which seems to be less than what the former CEO animatronics we heard about were capable of. The main argument against this idea is that I'm not sure how I feel about adding more mechanical puppets into the mix of what Lumen might be up to. And the fact that we presumably saw one in the hall shadowing Mark in episode 1. We'll see though, because there is something up with them. And the whole idea of introducing the idea of Kier having a twin, even if he ultimately turned into the forest. After they arrived at Woe's Hollow, I started to settle into the idea that everything Milchek described in the video presentation earlier was true, and that this was all really happening. This was mostly because he was physically there, unlike the first time we saw him on the seemingly out-of-place TV. After he commends them for achieving their directive and making it to the sacred earth where the founder once stood, Irv tells them they're starving, and he assures them that Lumen will always protect and provide. And if we're to believe him, they go above and beyond to give people who have never had a night's sleep what can only be described as a glamping experience. Copious luxury meats on the grill, heated tents in MDR blue, 4-ply tissue in the outhouses, branded industrial-sized marshmallows to roast over the fire, and torches to provide heat and light for each of them. As they settle in, Helena makes one final attempt to sell Irv on her deception. She jokes with him about eating the seal, and he admits to being embarrassed about the suggestion. Then he tries to get her to come clean about what she really saw during the OTC. At the same time, she continues to deny it right up until she realizes it's not working and probably will never work. Then we see her drop her eyebrows in a sort of double look where she takes off her mask and looks committed to dealing with the situation differently. It's a great touch that really connects all of the dots that had been laid out for us to pick up on. It's the right time to put the mystery to rest as well. For me, the most critical part of this debate has always been that there was no sensible reason for the Egans to send Helly R back to MDR after what she'd done. The PR campaign was complete whether she undermined it or not. Everything we saw this season was the show doing a pretty commendable job of making it possible that it might be the innie we got attached to last season down there. Through that lens, there were plenty of details that, when taken together, added up to support my thinking. And based on the post on the show's subreddit, this also worked the other way if you were a Helly R truther. From my perspective, the more logical explanation turned out to be what was really going on, but I never felt like I knew for sure until the end of this episode. That's entertaining for a few episodes and works out well if you can pull it off. And they added this extra dimension of Helena feeling jealous of her innie's freedom to be who she wanted to be and her romantic connection with Mark. Because after she sets her plan B in motion, which includes leaning on Mark's affection for her and calling out the Dieter story for what it was to sort of look cool in front of the group, except for Irv, who still has some reverence for the founder, when he brings up the Night Gardener again, she seizes the opportunity to turn everyone against him. As Miss Huang plays the theremin, and Milchek gets pissed about their lack of team spirit and blasphemy about the fourth appendix, Helena hits Irv where it hurts when she says they all know he's upset because he can't see Bert again, and that he's really lonely. That and the realization that it's 3 against 1 gets him to walk off alone in the dark, while we get a great shot of the Kier marshmallows melting in the fire to underline how bad this all ends up going for Milchek. Then Helena and Mark get a second chance at an intimate moment. This time, Mark finally makes a move, and things escalate quickly. They start getting undressed, and things get real. It's all cut with Irv walking in the dark, calling out for Mr. Milchek and Miss Huang, who never respond. He falls and loses his torch. They're making love in the warm glow of their heater, and the direct contrast is hard to miss. He eventually lays down against a rock, and I felt pretty sure he was going to die there. Back in the tent, Helena appears to come clean, saying she didn't like who she was outside. Mark follows with a question, "Who were you?" A nice play on the central question of the series. Then he says he doesn't care anyways. He doesn't care who she is out there, he cares who she is inside with him, which really digs into that extra dimension I mentioned. Before their post-coital bliss completely overwhelms them, Mark has a reintegration flash where he sees Gemma, which as far as I can tell is the only evidence we get that he did the session with Ragabi at the end of the last episode. She notices it, he doesn't know what happened, and that's the last we see of them together for now. It turns out Irv is not dead, although you can't be entirely sure that the dream he wakes up in is not his transition into the afterlife at first. He's in his work attire, walking through the frozen forest where he discovers the MDR cubicle. The screen on his terminal is a negative image in white, and bugs are flittering around, landing on the screen. He sits down to work on a file named Montauk. and we see Bert drop the divider to smile at him from the other side. Then he notices Woe from the illustration from the appendix typing away at a different terminal. It's dreamy and creepy. She also smiles at him, and we get a quick glimpse of her screen, which is hard to make out, but to me it looks like she's working on the same file. The numbers on his screen start to move around, and as her typing intensifies, they rearrange themselves so that there are only ones, zeros, and letters to spell out Egan. There's a pattern that looks like a face with a moving mouth, and then he looks over to find Woe sitting right next to him. Then he wakes up next to the rock, not dead at all, and he starts running. The simplest explanation here is that he can access his Audi's shared subconscious while asleep. That appeared to be the whole point of the late night coffee drinking, to get him to doze off during office hours so that he could see this image that he kept painting. What we see is not as cut and dry as that, and there's probably more going on, more to unpack, but he wakes up knowing that the reason the Audi version of Helly can be on the severed floor is because she's an Egan. While he's running to look for her, everyone else wakes up to realize they're missing. He finds her at the waterfall and confronts her, pointing out that what she did at the campfire was cruel. Helly was never cruel, so if she isn't her, and he spins Mark's question back around asking, "Who are you? Who would have the power to send their Audi to the severed floor?" For most of the exchange, she tries to persuade him he's mistaken, but eventually just says she's sorry, and then he grabs her and starts pulling her toward the edge of the water. He's screaming, and it gets incredibly intense because it feels like there's no way they can both walk away from this. Given who they are and how they fit into the story, it feels much more likely that something would happen to Irv, even while he's shouting she's an Audi and starting to force Milchek into switching her back by holding her head under the water. If everything that came before this was tense, you need a different word to describe where this scene goes. Combustible, feverish, something for the heightened sense of tension. Fractious, maybe? Irv surely must know that he's crossing a point of no return. And Helena has every reason to believe her life is threatened. We know that in his despair, Irv made peace with the idea of non-existence because in some way he'd be joining Bert there. Still, this felt fast. There were some rumblings based on an off-season interview and some of the imagery in the trailers that made me guess something like this might happen. But this is a small group. There's only 4 of them, and one has been completely compromised this season while one is in the process of reintegrating. We're losing a significant part of the team here, and we haven't even hit the midway point of the season yet. The performances here reached a new height, and Turturro has consistently stood out. He manages to capture the finality and any Irv's understanding of what he's setting in motion. He's not just pushing boundaries to test Mr. Milchek's patience here. He's actively threatening to kill the future CEO of the company. There really is no coming back from that. The rest of the cast does their part and then some. Dylan deals with the weirdness in the lead up and wishes he'd trusted his friend. Helena and Seth react to the worst case scenario. As I teased at the beginning, Mark will have a lot to process when he tries to make peace with the idea that he slept with Helena rather than Helly, and that he didn't even notice she wasn't herself over the past few days. For the details, Irv continues to dunk Helena's head under the water while shouting that she's been an Audi the whole time. She's an Egan and a mole, and he wants Milchek to reactivate Helly to prove she's infiltrated their group. He's standing there knowing his future hangs in the balance based on his decision, and I like to think there's a version of this story where he thinks to himself, I was just trying to do something nice here and take them outside, let them experience a night's sleep. How did it come to this? When they all start to believe Irv might really kill the Egan heiress, she screams, "God damn it, Seth, do it." This is a somewhat insignificant detail, but we know calling him by his first name tips their hand since we saw Miss Wong interrupt the family session when Gretchen almost revealed that information to Dylan. And I say insignificant because of what happens, but as it's playing out, we're all on the edge of our seats waiting to see if he's right. So it's another piece of the puzzle locking into place as we get there. Moench talks to someone on the radio telling them to remove the Glasgow block now. Helly wakes up while her head is still submerged, and Seth and Mark run down to see if she's alright. Irv apologizes to her as Helly tries to figure out what's going on, and holds her until the others arrive. Moench orders him to stand and condemns him for threatening collegial murder in the Pond of Woe's Hollow. The only penalty that makes sense is immediate and permanent dismissal, and there's no debate. Dylan screams he's sorry for not listening, and Irv tries to comfort his friend, saying, "It's okay, it's all okay. Just remember, hang in there." Which hit me as weird. Irv has been known to deliver an odd twist of phrase, but they're usually related to and sound like the teachings of Kier. This made me think of the motivational poster in the break room that shows Dylan holding the switches during the OTC, but that might just be because it was posted online by the crew and I used it as the background on our live stream. It stands out in a dramatic scene that otherwise plays mostly straight, and it will turn out to be the last thing that this innie says. He does engage in a tremendous stare down with Seth, and we see him cycle through a range of emotions as he listens to Moench explain how they'll make it as if he never existed nor drew a single breath on Earth. It does appear as though he finds peace as he's marched into the forest, as Seth makes a call to shut him down with the final words, "May Kier's mercy follow you into the eternal dark," and then the episode cuts to that. It had a fantastic ending, and I really liked how they handled the reveal and more broadly the mystery of whether it was Helly or Helena. It was fun to look for clues, and they kept the mystery going for as long as possible without it becoming too tedious. My interest in watching people argue over small details has officially depleted, so I am glad it's over, and there are plenty of other questions out there for us to redirect our attention to. When it came to Helena watching the tape, the notion that she might be sheltered enough to be jealous of the intimacy was hard to wrap my head around. This is something people were bringing up right away. I assumed that her upbringing and current position in the family was so restrictive that even though the innie existed in what is essentially a prison, Helena still saw her as enjoying an appealing sense of freedom that she didn't have. Like, that's what she was really jealous of. Because the Ouyang's are weird, but they also provide their employees with waffle parties. I didn't expect that she was somehow limited in pursuit of romantic entanglements. Going for it with Mark here really makes me wonder about the devotion to Kier and his principles even at this level. I assumed that the culty stuff was mainly meant for others, their subordinates, while the Ouyang's did what they wanted. This might hint at another level of things to discover, which has me intrigued. I mean, because for the innies it makes sense. They start out as children, essentially, and are sort of growing up in front of our eyes. Helena is not the same. She's a grown woman, so it's interesting to think about where they're going with that. Also, the one thing I didn't hit in my notes from the scene in the tent was Helena apologizing for distracting him from looking for his wife. There's a sense that while he's doing that mission out of responsibility for his outie, he's doing what he's doing with Helly because that's what he wants. And I suppose this has been presenting a pronounced kink in things for a while. Kink as in disruption of something that's otherwise straightforward, not the other way it could be interpreted. This starts to seem immediate now that we're thinking about him becoming reintegrated. So I guess the new mystery might be whether Irv will return, but I think I've clarified my feelings about that. Just give his outie more to do, and then let's see how the remaining players react to what happened. There's quite a bit of fallout waiting for them. If Cold Harbor is as important as they've been making it out to be, Irv may have managed to force the Ouyang's hand. They really might have to send Helly back to ensure he finishes things. Plus, we've yet to see how quickly Ragabi can reintegrate him. The ending brought things around with the combo of the reveal and the loss of a significant character. As I mentioned at the beginning, I pretty much needed this by the time we got it because the sense of unrealness was taking me out of things in the first half. It's cool to see them taking chances even if I didn't enjoy the ride as much as I'm sure some people will, because it does make sense. The innies should be disoriented, and it seems like Lumen wanted to scare them at the same time. I do guess I might be in the minority, and I imagine that some people, this will be their favorite episode of the entire series. I just feel like the show taught me to pay close attention to everything, and I felt like I couldn't trust what I saw, so it was hard to do that. I'm curious to see how Monday morning will play out with everyone involved, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. We'll be doing the live stream again tomorrow night, Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, like we've been doing all season, so join us for that. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.